There is a story about a man walking through a forest at twilight. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, and the world is turning that deep shade of blue that borders on the surreal. In this moment of quiet, he stumbles upon a coil of rope on the ground. Startled, his heart races, for in the fading light, he believes he has encountered a snake. He freezes, fear gripping his chest, and his mind spirals into chaos, imagining all the ways this creature could harm him. But as his eyes adjust and his breath slows, the truth becomes clear. It is not a snake at all, but a simple piece of rope. What was once a cause of great suffering turns out to be an illusion, a creation of his own mind. This is the nature of suffering. We imagine threats, conjure anxieties, and bind ourselves with fear, just as the man did with the rope. But suffering is not the rope itself, it's the snake we project onto it. You see, suffering is born from our attachment to the idea that life should be different than it is. We are conditioned from birth to believe that pleasure is good, pain is bad, and that happiness comes only from acquiring, achieving, and controlling. We construct elaborate stories about who we are, where we're going, and what will finally make us whole. But like the man mistaking the rope for a snake, these stories are fabrications, narratives we use to make sense of a world that cannot be tamed by our desires. The Buddha once said, "Life is suffering," but he wasn't condemning us to misery. He was revealing a simple truth. Suffering exists because we resist the natural flow of life. We cling to the highs and flee from the lows, but life doesn't play by our rules. It gives us pleasure and pain, light and shadow, birth and death, two sides of the same coin. In our effort to control one side, we miss the beauty of the whole. Think of a river. It flows freely, winding and curving, sometimes swift, sometimes calm. But what happens when we try to dam it, to hold back its course? The water, once gentle, becomes a force of destruction, pushing against the barriers, breaking free with even more intensity. Our minds are like that river, naturally flowing from joy to sorrow, from peace to turbulence. But when we resist its current, when we try to block out discomfort, we only strengthen our suffering. So why do we suffer? We suffer because we forget that we are the river, not the dam. We suffer because we cling to an idea of permanence in a world that is constantly changing. We suffer because we believe the illusion that we are separate from the whole, isolated and incomplete, when in truth we are already part of the dance of existence, whole and perfect, just as we are. The irony is that our very efforts to escape suffering often lead us deeper into it. We think, if I can only get more money, more love, more success, then I will be free from this pain. But in chasing these things, we forget that life is not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be lived. We miss the present moment, where true peace resides, because we are too busy pursuing an imaginary future where all our problems will be fixed. But what if we stop running? What if, instead of trying to avoid suffering, we embraced it? What if we saw pain not as an enemy, but as a teacher? The man in the forest suffered because he misinterpreted the rope as a snake. But in the moment of realization, when he saw the truth, his fear dissolved. He understood that the suffering was not in the world, but in his mind. Suffering, in its essence, is the friction between what is and what we want it to be. When we release our grip on how things should be, we create space for how things are. And in that space, we find peace. This is not resignation, not a giving up, but a deep, profound acceptance of life in all its forms, the joy, the sorrow, the beauty, and the pain. So, why do we suffer? Because we forget that we are not separate from the universe, but expressions of it. We forget that life is not meant to be controlled, but experienced. And we forget that within every moment of suffering, there is a hidden invitation to wake up to see the rope for what it is. In the end, suffering is not something to escape. but something to understand. It is the doorway to wisdom, the path to liberation. For when we see through the illusion, we remember that we are not broken, but whole, not lost, but home. And in that remembering, the grip of suffering loosens, and we are free. The question is not why we suffer. The question is, can we see the truth behind the suffering? Can we step back and recognize the rope for what it is? Only then can we stop mistaking the illusions of our mind for the reality of life. And when we do, we discover something remarkable. The suffering that once seemed so real, so powerful, becomes nothing more than a passing cloud in the vast sky of our being, a sky that has always been clear, open, and free.